This is my academic exploration into a rather persistent and, frankly, often sobering political puzzle. We seem to live in an age saturated with images of protest, streets filled with people demanding change, smartphones capturing every chant, every clash. It looks like people power is everywhere. Yet, when you step back and look at the hard data, particularly over the last couple of decades, the actual track record of these mass demonstrations in achieving their biggest prize, overthrowing the government, is, let's just say, less impressive than the headlines might suggest. So, the central question driving this series, the one we'll keep circling back to, is this: what factors explain the limited success of mass demonstrations in overthrowing modern regimes? Why the apparent disconnect between mobilization and actual regime mortality? This first episode is about laying the groundwork. We need to get our terms straight, because vague concepts lead to analytically useless conclusions. We'll introduce the main theoretical framework scholars use to try and make sense of this chaos, outline how we'll attempt to compare apples and oranges across history and geography, and set the stage for the dramas, and often tragedies, to come. Since I'm flying solo here, rely on the slides flashing before your eyes for the data points and models I'll be referencing. All right, before we dive into the why, we need to agree on the what. Social science often involves taking messy reality and forcing it into neat boxes, operationalization. It's essential, if occasionally unsatisfying. First, mass demonstrations. We're not talking about your local NIMBY protest. We mean the big ones, sustained public outpourings involving significant chunks of the population, demanding fundamental change and disrupting business as usual. Crucially, we need metrics, however arbitrary they might feel, numbers, duration, spread, to separate the truly regime-threatening events from, shall we say, collective expressions of temporary frustration. Second, government regimes. Not all states are created equal, especially in their tolerance for dissent. We need to differentiate. Are we talking about a consolidated democracy where protests are almost part of the furniture? A hybrid system trying to look democratic while rigging the game? Or a full-blown autocracy where showing up to protest is potentially a life-altering decision? We'll use standard political science tools like VDEM or polity scores to try and pin down where regimes sit on the spectrum. Finally, the trickiest one, success. For this series, we're setting the bar high. Success means the movement achieves its maximalist goal, the overthrow of the central government leadership or the system itself, directly because of the protests. Forget minor concessions or policy changes designed to take the steam out of the movement. We're talking about the moment the people in power lose their grip. Defining it this way is crucial for clarity, even if it means classifying many movements that achieved something as failures in our specific, rather demanding context. Now, why do some movements mobilize millions while others fizzle out? And why do even the big ones often fail? Social scientists have developed various theoretical lenses to grapple with this. We'll lean on four foundational ones. First, Olson's collective action theory delivers a dose of cynical realism. It highlights the free rider problem. Participating in a protest is risky and costly, but if the movement succeeds, everyone benefits, participant or not. So, the purely rational choice? Let someone else do the dangerous work. This basic logic helps explain why huge levels of discontent often coexist with political apathy. Overcoming this is the first hurdle. Second, resource mobilization theory basically says, okay, forget grievances for a second, where's the infrastructure? Movements, like any complex operation, need resources, money, skilled organizers, communication channels, maybe even just office space and printers. McCarthy and Zald shifted focus to how movements gather and deploy these tangible assets. Anger is abundant, but effective organization is scarce. Third, political process theory broadens the view. McAdam, Tilley, Tarot, and others argue that movement success is critically dependent on the wider political environment. Are there divisions among the ruling elites? Has the state's repressive capacity weakened? Are there powerful allies available? This approach emphasizes political opportunities, moments when the system is unusually vulnerable, alongside the movement's own ability to frame its message persuasively and leverage existing networks. Fourth, and this is crucial for understanding our current moment, we have what I'll call digital repertoires theory. Scholars like Zeynep Tufekci, Lance Bennett, and Alexandra Sedgerberg have shown how digital technologies have fundamentally altered mobilization dynamics. Social media makes it far easier to gather enormous crowds quickly, but often at the expense of organizational depth and strategic capacity. What Tufekci calls the tactical freeze, movements that excel at mobilization but struggle with adaptation and long-term strategy, helps explain the curious phenomenon of massive protests that simply fizzle. As the diagram shows, these theories aren't mutually exclusive. They're tools in our kit, helping us analyze how grievances, resources, opportunities, and now technology interact, often in complex and unpredictable ways, to produce the messy reality of protest and its consequences. Our case selection isn't just throwing darts at a map. We need variation. We'll examine protests in rigid autocracies, murky hybrid systems, and even established democracies, because the dynamics are wildly different. We'll focus on protests that were undeniably mass events. And crucially, we need different outcomes, comparing the rare outright successes with the more common failures and those frustrating cases that almost made it helps us isolate what might actually make a difference. We'll stick to our strict definition of success, regime overthrow, when evaluating outcomes. Our evidence base will be mixed. We'll crunch numbers from protest databases and regime datasets where possible, including the Carnegie Global Protest Tracker, NAVCO, and the Mass Mobilization Project, which has meticulously documented over 16,000 protests globally since 1990. We'll cross-reference these with VDEM and polity scores to situate protests within their regime contexts. But we'll also immerse ourselves in qualitative historical accounts and detailed case studies written by scholars who have spent years studying specific events. The hope is that by combining these approaches, we can identify factors that consistently seem to sabotage movements aiming for regime change in our current era, especially when set against historical precedents. You can't understand today's struggles without glancing back. Mass protest isn't new, but the game seems to have changed. Consider this rough timeline. 1848, Europe's springtime of peoples. Massive continent-wide uprisings, mostly crushed or co-opted within months. A powerful reminder that mobilization doesn't equal victory. Then jump to 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, communist regimes across Eastern Europe crumble, often with astonishing speed in the face of street protests. For a moment, it looked like history was accelerating towards liberal democracy, powered by ordinary people. That year looms large in the imagination. But then came 2011 and the Arab Spring. Initial, dizzying successes in Tunisia and Egypt fueled global optimism. But that quickly soured, leading to brutal civil wars in Syria and Libya, democratic backsliding in Egypt, and general instability. The outcomes were patchy, often tragic. The period from 2019 to 2023 deserves special attention. According to the Carnegie Endowment's Global Protest Tracker, this period saw an unprecedented global wave of mass protests, including massive mobilizations in Chile, Lebanon, Iraq, Hong Kong, Belarus, Myanmar, Iran, and Sudan. The numbers are staggering. The 2019 protests in Chile drew roughly 25% of the country's population, while Hong Kong's demonstrations mobilized nearly 30% of residents at their peak. Yet, in terms of our narrow definition of success, regime overthrow, the results have been overwhelmingly disappointing. Most regimes have weathered these storms. And that brings us to the present. Today's movements often embrace a leaderless structure, partly as protection against targeted repression. But this flexibility comes at a cost: strategic coherence. Meanwhile, regimes have developed sophisticated digital surveillance capabilities, creating what some scholars call digital authoritarianism. The Chinese model of internet control has been actively exported to dozens of countries, allowing precise targeting of activists through facial recognition, social media monitoring, and mobile phone tracking. This sharpens our puzzle. Why does the 1989 playbook seem so ineffective now? Was 1989 an anomaly? Have regimes adapted, becoming more resilient, more ruthless, or just better at using technology for control? That's what we need to unpack. And so, we conclude our scene-setting first episode. Let's quickly distill what we've covered, as laid out on this final slide. We've articulated our central, rather stark research question about the limited success of modern protests. We wrestled our key concepts into operational definitions, a necessary chore for any serious analysis. We introduced our main theoretical frameworks: Olson reminding us why it's hard to get people out in the first place, resource mobilization asking about the practicalities, political process theory emphasizing context and timing, and crucially, the newer digital repertoire's perspective that helps explain the curious phenomenon of massive but strategically limited movements. We laid out our plan to compare cases across time and regimes. And we sketched the historical backdrop, contrasting the apparent ease of 1989 with the tougher realities protesters face today. What are the initial takeaways? First, fuzzy thinking won't cut it here. We need analytical rigor. Second, explaining protest failure is multifaceted. It's rarely just not enough people or bad leadership. Structural factors, resource deficits, and sheer bad luck in timing often play huge roles. Third, digital technologies have created a paradoxical situation. Lower barriers to mobilization, but potentially shallower organizational capacity. Meanwhile, regimes have gotten remarkably good at turning these same technologies against protesters. The recent mass mobilization project data is particularly illuminating here. They've found that since 2010, governments have become significantly more likely to employ targeted repression using digital surveillance rather than indiscriminate violence, which often backfires. And fourth, the optimism of the post-Cold War era feels distant. This foundation is crucial as we move forward. Next time, in episode 2, we get down to specifics. We'll begin dissecting the particular challenges faced when confronting autocratic regimes. We'll focus on the sharp end of state power, repression, the state's willingness and capacity to inflict violence, and the absolutely critical variable of security force loyalty. Why do soldiers and police sometimes shoot at citizens and sometimes refuse? Understanding that is key to understanding autocratic survival. Thank you for joining me on this initial foray. I hope it's been sufficiently intriguing, if perhaps not entirely cheerful. Until next time, when we delve into the mechanics of autocratic control, this is Kaede signing off.